Hi, here we are with the Restoration. Now, technically, we kind of already got into this time period with John Milton. But of course, Milton was not really all about the Restoration. If you recall, Milton was a supporter of Cromwell. And when Charles II comes to the throne and the English monarchy is restored, the whole mood changes. Okay? The whole mood changes. And this is part of why Milton wrote Paradise Lost. But as for us, we now have to move into our new book, which you can't see apparently. Trust me, there's a new book there. Looks just like me, only not. There we go, kind of, sort of there. Anyhow, because we want to talk about John Dryden. John Dryden, the first poet laureate of England. Dryden is an incredibly important figure for this time period. We don't get to read a lot of Dryden in this class just because of the nature of the survey. Some of his poems are very long and complicated. We're just reading a short poem called Macflecknoe, okay, the satire. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, the thing to remember about Dryden is he is writing in what are called heroic couplets, okay? Heroic couplets are rhymed lines of iambic pentameter. Okay, so remember, iambic means the soft hard, right? Dum bum, dum bum, dum bum, dum bum, right? And penta, of course, means 5, as we all remember from our ancient Greek class. And so we're talking about a 5-line or 5 beats, right? 5 stresses in every line. Okay, now Milton wrote iambic pentameter lines, but he did not rhyme, right? And as you recall, he has that little blurb at the beginning of Paradise Lost where he talks about not liking the notion of rhymes, right? What he called the jingling sound of like endings. Okay. Before we read Milton, of course, we did read some of the metaphysical poets, including Andrew Marvell. And Marvell used iambic tetrameter lines, right, to his coy mistress. Tetra being 4, right? So there were shorter lines. So Dryden pulls out a longer line, which is essentially, the same as what is being used by Milton, except now he's rhyming. It's not just a little thing, though, to rhyme. Okay, when you have these A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D structures all the way through, and every now and then he'll throw in a triplet where there's 3 in a row of rhymed words. It tends to create little units. That is to say, the poem itself is kind of built with these bricks or building blocks of 2-line units. And sometimes, and we'll see this even more when we look at Alexander Pope in a few weeks, these can become tiny little aphorisms. An aphorism is like a saying, right? Something that can be taken out of the poem and looked at just simply on its own. Okay? That's one of the benefits. Now, the heroic couplet is very much a tight structure. Okay, but it goes with the sense of the time period too. In other words, there's a reason why Dryden is writing in this form. Right? There's a strong sense of decorum. Like Grandma said, proper things in proper places. And whether you're writing a serious poem like Absalom and Achitophel, which we're not reading, of course, but it's one of Dryden's most important poems. It's a very long poem. It concerns the proposed succession of one of Charles II's illegitimate children to the throne over the brother, James II. You may recall from my previous video about this time period that young man rather unfortunately wound up getting his head knocked in with a hammer because of treason. Dryden had been arguing in Absalom and Achitophel for mercy for the young man. It didn't work. Dryden is, as I said, closely associated with Charles II, and then he becomes closely associated with James II. He is, as I said, the poet laureate. He's the first poet laureate of England, and what the job of the poet laureate is essentially to show up with poems at important occasions, baptisms of children, weddings, so forth and so on, right? Important occasions of various sorts, right? As such, Dryden stands very much in a different place from what you're going to see, for instance, if you study the Romantic poets of, the late 18th century and the early 19th century. The Romantic poets are all about the subjective experience of the individual poet, right? And that's, like I said, that's English 216. We can talk about that semester. The point is, there's nothing very deeply personal about the poetry of John Dryden. Okay, in other words, we're not really learning how he feels as he went walking through a field out there with little bouncy flowers and stuff like that. You're not getting any of that. Okay, it's all very public. He deals with very big issues, grand issues. As I said, as poet laureate, he was responsible for writing poems on certain occasions. He also wrote a satire, right? McFlecknoe is a satire that we're going to be looking at. Now, I know that a lot of students have issues, especially with satire of this time. I would like you to stop and think about it for just a second, though. Imagine it was somewhat in the future, maybe 100 years in the future. And we were studying late night comedy shows, right? Like a Jimmy Fallon type. And the reason I bring this up is we would not possibly understand what was going on in these monologues, whether it's on the Tonight Show or whatever, without footnotes, without some explanation for who and what it is being talked about. Because it's all very topical. It's all very much of the moment, okay? And when we look at McFlecknoe, I want you to keep that in mind as well. We don't know who Shadwell is. We probably don't care who Shadwell is. Why would we, right? A kind of mediocre writer who was trying to make himself sound better than he really was, making comparisons to the great Ben Jonson, who unfortunately we did not have time to study in this class. And he basically drove Dryden nuts after a while. It's like, enough already. You're not that good. And he produces McFlecknoe, what he describes as a mock heroic, right? And so, yes, it may be tiresome to read footnotes just to understand what the heck is going on. But once you kind of get away from that, and you look at it as more of a sense of, okay, I understand how somebody can drive you nuts who insists on their greatness when they're really not that great. And so the purpose of satire, of course, is to make fun of something, but it's also to make fun of something to instruct, to point something out. And this is what Dryden does. And he does this by an inversion of values. Everything that normally would be considered good is bad. Everything that is bad is good. So if you lack talent, normally in real life, that's not good. In the poem, that makes you great. And if you lack the most talent, if you're the most inept, if you're the most incompetent, if you're the most boring, most unoriginal, you're the king. you get to be in charge because you're the best by being the worst. Okay. You do, as I said, probably need to study the notes. But once you kind of get through that, I think there's a lot of stuff that's really easy fun. Right? I mean, I love some of the lines in this poem. And let me just look at the opening couplet. All human things are subject to decay. Now notice how that it seems like a very serious statement, right? And when fate summons, monarchs must obey. So even kings have to die, right? This Flecknoe found, who, like Augustus young, was called to empire and had governed long. Now, one of the things I want to draw attention to is what are called caesura. A caesura is a pause in the line, okay? So in that third line, this Flecknoe found, and notice the alliteration, Flecknoe found, comma, who, comma, like Augustus, comma, young, was called to empire, comma, and had governed long, semicolon, end of line. It chops it up. And this is purposeful, right? And one of the things I want you to focus on is the echo of sound and sense. How Dryden uses the language to convey the meaning, okay? But he also uses rhyme, meter, alliteration, consonants, assonance, and these pauses, caesura, right? To force the reader, force is probably overstating it, but to kind of convey a sense to the reader, right? This is awkward. Well, guess what? Flecknoe is awkward. And his son, Mech Flecknoe, right, son of Flecknoe, is even more awkward. Now, just a couple notes about Dryden's life before I finish. Dryden, as I said, was associated with Charles II and James II. But James II, as I had already told you, was deposed by his daughter and son-in-law in what was called the Glorious Revolution. So there was a change in monarchy, and Dryden, who was the poet laureate and associated with James, and who had also converted to Catholicism, because that was what was in favor at the time. I shouldn't say that, like he didn't have a sincere belief, but he converts to Catholicism. He's out of a job once the new king and queen come into town. Okay. He experienced great poverty for a while. And then near the end of his life, he did something that's very, very important. He started to sell translations of Virgil, Boccaccio, right? He started to sell translations of poetry. He sold them by subscription, which means people would buy the book before it even came out. And in doing so, he was able to make money. In other words, Dryden is one of the first, if not the first, writers to actually make a living without a patron, to make money writing. This has enormous impact as we move forward. The concept that you can actually make money to support yourself as a writer. When I was in grad school a long time ago, I had a professor whose name, by the way, was also Professor Hoffman. No relationship, of course. And he was a funny old guy. And he invited me over to his place, his home off campus, because I was leaving early, and he always liked to have his grad students over for a social event. And it was just the two of us. And he brought out a copy of Dryden's translation of the Aeneid. The original, the actual one. It was hundreds of years old. It was like from 1700, right? And then I spilled coffee on it. No, I didn't spill coffee on it. Trust me. I just kind of approached it, on my hands and knees and just kind of touched it like that. But it was pretty fabulous. Big book, hand sewn, right? Lots of pictures in it. Quite an incredible experience, actually. It's a museum quality type book.